Hey guys, this is Sean. I got Chris on the camera. We're here in Worcester, Mass, working with Ryan Breuer at the Workshop for Tour de Forge Round 2.
Hey gents, welcome to the Workshop here in Worcester, Massachusetts. This is a industrial makerspace where I do basically all of my forging and knife work and other projects here. Right in here is the blacksmith shop. So this is where all the hot work happens. In the blacksmith shop, we have a lot of really great tools, a lot of stuff that a college kid my age would have no way of accessing or purchasing or using without this kind of makerspace. So it's really great that I have access to all these tools. So in the middle we have all the propane forges. We have 4 different propane forges. We have a forced air forge here with a blower underneath. That's a great all-purpose forge. And we have a couple of just direct propane forges. This one here is our welding forge for doing Damascus and other types of forge welding. As far as the big heavy tools, we have our 16-ton hydraulic press with the googly eyes. We have one of our power hammers here. I believe this is a 20-pound stroke power hammer. We have a bunch of anvils. We have a number of these. We run a lot of classes, so it's important that we have enough workspace for all the students. We have a coal forge here if you want to do things the traditional way, or if you're coming in on a cold winter morning and you realize that someone's used up all the propane and you realize that you need to learn how to coal forge. We have the oxyacetylene torch for doing whatever work you need to do with that. A little oxyacetylene cutting, or doing localized heating for edge quenches or other types of work if you're a knife maker. We have another power hammer over here, as well as some miscellaneous tools. We have a rolling mill. We have a lot of other smaller pieces of equipment. So the blacksmith shop is really well kitted out. I've been able to do a lot of great work in here. The only thing we don't have that you might see at a bigger shop is like a really long sword forge if we're doing specialized sword work like you might see at Dragon's Breath or Baltimore Knife and Sword.
Welcome to Tour de Forge, episode technically 2. We haven't done very much with our knives yet. As you can see here, we have our start.
Yep.
That one is the one I started.
Yeah, there you go.
This one is the one Theo worked on, and we got Sean's here as well. So,
all right, so we have some points really nicely forged in. When you're making a knife, that's usually the first step that you go for as you forge in that point. Before we move into the next step, we have to talk about some design decisions. We have to talk about how we want this knife to turn out. So you have a couple different options here. One of the big choices you have to make pretty early on is your handle construction. Most folks will be familiar with full tang and hidden tang. So we have a hidden tang knife where the portion of the knife that's in the handle is hidden by the handle material, and that has its own forging process. And then we have a knife where the steel that's in the handle is the full contour, is the full shape of the handle, and that has its own different forging process. And so we have to make that decision before we really get into much more of the knife making, because the next step here after we forged our points is to do what's called isolating the tang, isolating the material of the steel that's going to be the handle away from the portion of the steel that's going to be the blade. So have you guys thought about this? Do you want to do a hidden tang? Do you want to do a full tang construction?
what do you think?
I think I want to do a full tang.
I as well want to do a full tang.
Yeah, we have
I
the sort
like
of
the
the
feel of this one. I think that'd be a good one for us to
great.
start on.
Yeah, so as far as difficulty goes, you have a trade-off. So forging the hidden tang is normally easier, but then doing the handle work after it's forged is much more difficult.
Right.
Forging the tang of a full tang knife is usually more technically difficult in the forging process, but then once you've forged it, the handle processes are usually a bit easier. Because you can just grind flat and put some handle scales on there, or you can do what I've done here and do a wrap of some kind. Whereas if you have a hidden tang knife, then you're locked yourself into getting into this piece of wood and scraping and filing and gouging it out and then fitting that up real nice, and there's a lot more technical expertise that goes into completing that handle.
Gotcha.
All right, so we've decided that we want to do some full tangs. We have our points established. So the next step that we're going to do is we're going to what's called isolating a shoulder. So we're going to sort of isolate this material like this, and we're going to have a step there, and that'll be the start of our handle. And we can move that step sort of up or down depending on how long we want our knife to be in the end. If we want a really, really long knife, we say, all right, well, maybe we only need this much material for a handle, and then we have that much for the blade. If we say, all right, well, I want a more reasonably sized knife, we can move that up, forge our handle out, and then any extra can get cut off at the end down here. But since we've established our point, that position's not going to move, that's going to stay where it is, so we have to decide how long we want our blade between that point and our isolation. Once we've forged in that isolation, and we have that material set aside, then I would usually work on the blade first and forge in my blade profile and my bevels, and then go back to forging in the contours of the handle. So I think that's what we'll probably do today. We'll forge in that isolation, then we'll move back to the blade, do some bevel work, do some profiling work, and then if we have extra time, we'll move back into doing the handle.
Sounds good.
You guys have any questions?
When do we start?
All right, let's go. We should have some hot steel here. Yeah. So we were talking earlier about wanting to create that, that isolation between the blade material and the tang material. I say maybe I want about a 4-inch knife. We'll get a little bit of extra blade length when we do the beveling process. So you want to account for maybe 10-15% growth along the edge. But here we'll come into the edge of the anvil. We'll be using a half face blow here, and we'll start creating that shoulder. And you're seeing me turn it every blow, so I can see where I'm starting to create that step to make sure I'm lining it up every time. My steel's starting to get a little bit of cold. You can see we've just started to cut in here. We've just started to make that location where we want to start isolating material. It's very important that you come back to the same place every time and re-register where your steel is. If you just kind of wail at it and it's bouncing back and forth, then you create a bunch of little boop, 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 which is no good. So I'm just sort of coming in and cutting in that step there.
Oh, yeah.
That's the most important transition. So once I get that going, we're leaving material out here for our full tang. That'll be our blade shape. We've talked a little bit about bevels and where we want to establish those bevels. On a full tang knife like this, I would say we'd start maybe about 1 centimeter above from that isolation. When you're forging bevels, you want to be forging on the edge of an anvil because you're coming in at an angle. Both your workpiece is at an angle and your hammer is coming down at an angle. And those two angles coming together are what's forming those bevels. So I normally forge some here, and I'll flip around and I'll do some here. And those will be my two kind of forging locations. So just like if you were grinding in bevels, we're talking about plunge lines, it's important to keep the two sides symmetrical and even. And you want to keep the point where those bevels start to be the same on both sides. So when I'm here and I start 1 centimeter up, when I flip it around, I'm also going to want to use the tactical cue of I can feel where that bevel started here to make sure I'm starting it at the same place there. As far as the hammer strokes, it's going to act similar to those half-face blows you were doing earlier, where you're coming down and you're landing sort of the center of your hammer over the edge. And so some of your hammer will be beyond the plane of the anvil, which is why we're working on the edge here. So we're going to come in, we're going to do some of this. We're going to go over here, we're going to do some of this. If you guys have ground knives or seen knives ground before, you'll know that they start by cutting in at a 45-degree angle and establishing the center ridge. And then they start creeping that bevel upwards. We're going to use the same sort of workflow here, where we come in at our most aggressive angle at the start to start the bevel, and then move that bevel upwards. Clip it now. All right, so we're going to do some Tang forging now. So from my earlier hydraulic press escapade, we have a lot more thickness right here than we need. That's really good because it means we can use the cross peen to widen that handle out. Depending on the contour you're looking for, there are a couple different things you can do. You can just do a sort of a straight swoop that flares out towards the end. You can have maybe a swell in the middle of your thumb. You could go for a finger well and then a handle. So there are a couple of different shapes you can work on. For my sake, I'll probably do just sort of a light contour with a little bit of a swell in the middle. So for me, what that's going to mean is drawing out this material in the middle to get more width here, going back to this flat to work down that finger groove here. I have more material than I'm going to need, but I can use some of that material in coming to here and upsetting that into itself to get more width at the end. So it's all about making sure that you have enough material to draw out to the widths you want it, and then when you're upsetting to get those grooves in there, you're going to expend the material in this direction too. So just like that first operation where we were isolating the tang, we're going to have that same back and forth of I'm working in the groove and now I'm keeping the thickness, and now I'm working in the groove and I'm keeping that thickness to make sure that you're not overly messing that up. So the deal with thermal cycling is we want to get it up to sort of a medium orange. We don't want to get all the way up to that yellow that we were forging at. You want to heat the thickest part first. So for us, that's going to be our tangs. Our tips are going to overheat much quicker than our tangs are going to. So we're going to go in, just place it down. You guys can do yours too. We're going to pay a little bit more attention to the color that we're getting. Once we get those tangs up, kind of close to where we want them, we're going to pull out, we're going to flip around. All right, so now we're kind of closing in on a temperature. We like, that temperature is what we want. We've heated up the tang, so we're going to flip around and get the blade end in there. So you guys should be able to do that now too. Yep, that's a good temperature. I'm going to flip around. Now some steels like a soak. ADCRV2 is a little bit higher alloy than a 1084 or a 1075. It has the chromium, it has the vanadium, so it's going to want a little more soak time to allow those alloying elements to allow the carbon to come into solution the way we want it to. Generally speaking, alloying elements like to form carbides, which are harder structures that we don't want right now in this process.
So by doing this, is this going to fix anything that may have gone wrong when I accidentally placed the blade?
Yes, ideally yes. Flip. Uh-oh. All right, go back to the heat. You just accidentally quenched your knife. You just quenched your knife into our little water basin. The only thing that you may have done that we wouldn't know now, you may have introduced a crack if your edge was thin enough at any one point, but I didn't hear a crack and I didn't see a crack, so I think you're going to be fine. Okay. But yes, normalizing cycles, as long as there aren't any like macroscopic flaws like cracks or fractures, thermal cycling will bring the steel back to a fresh, renewed state in the microscopic scale, in the grain scale. It can't fix a crack. It can fix grain growth. It can fix stresses from forging. All right, so this is a nice temperature. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to come and I'm going to bring my piece. I'm going to clamp it vertically in the vise. What this means is that if I were to lay it flat, it would be pulling heat out of one side faster than another side, and that would cause the material to warp in one direction. By clamping it flat like this, we're letting it cool off evenly in the air. That's the goal. So we have one vise there, we have one vise there, so each of you can go to a vise and clamp your piece down. So now we have our pieces cooling for our first thermal cycle. This is at the highest temperature. Our next cycles will be at slightly lower temperatures to encourage that grain to reduce down. Some smiths will let these cool all the way to room temperature. From a metallurgical standpoint, that isn't really necessary. What we're waiting for is for the steel to get below critical, for the phase change to take place from the austenitic phase, the supersaturated phase, down into what's probably going to be a perlite phase, which happens at around 1300 Fahrenheit, a little bit lower. So we're going to let it cool down to a visually a black color, and then we're going to let it go a little bit more. We're going to be around 800, 900 degrees Fahrenheit, and then we'll go back in for our next cycle. All right, so that one looks good. Yours looks good. Mine looks good. You can go grab your pieces. We'll go for our next cycle. One thing I'll have you do here, while we're talking about phase change, we have a magnet right here on the side of our the structure here. Now, if you touch your steel to your magnet right now, you'll feel that it's magnetic. It has a pull. It's steel. Steel is magnetic. But as we bring it up to temperature, we're going to bring it up above critical temperature, and that austenitic phase, that higher temperature phase, is actually no longer magnetic. And so you might see smiths, testing their knives on a magnet before they quench to make sure they're at the correct temperature. The magnet can't tell you everything. It can't tell you, if you're too hot beyond that point. What it can tell you is if you've reached critical temperature. All right, that's more or less about good. The heat's not super even, but what you're able to do is you're able to feel that's not magnetic anymore. Yep. There's no pull.
All right, so that's Tour de Forge episode 2. We got a lot more done on our knives. Definitely picking up the pace a little bit, and they're really starting to look like knives.
Yeah, you're really getting there. To do a quick recap, we did our handle isolation. We then moved into correcting our tips and forging out the bevels. Once the bevels were established, then we went back to the handle, and then we forged in some of the wells in the tang for your finger. The tangs are looking really good, and then we did some thermal cycling to get these guys ready for grinding.
Awesome. Well, we'll have to find someone else so we can go borrow a grinder.
Yep.
So thanks everybody for watching, and we'll catch
Thank you guys for coming down. It was a lot of fun having you.
Thank you for having
Great
us.
time.
We really
Great job.
appreciate it.
Thank you.
Great work. That's a wrap, folks.